Hello out there, and welcome back to The Independent Pianist. I am your host, Cole Anderson, as usual. Today's piece we're looking at, of course, is Rachmaninoff's Moment Musicale in B minor, one of his more popular works. This piece actually represents an interesting trend among Rachmaninoff's pieces, one that crops up from time to time throughout his career, which is a kind of intentional archaism. This kind of reaching towards the past and a bygone sound world is probably most famously demonstrated by his frequent use of the Dies Irae plain chant. Also, his large-scale work, The All-Night Vigil for a cappella choir, is another famous example of this. But it's also found in more subtle forms in his piano music, such as in his D minor minuet prelude from his Opus 23 Preludes, and the somewhat related D minor etude from the Etude Tableau Opus 33. They both have this kind of somewhat archaic minuet flavor to them. And of course there's also pieces like the Variations on a Theme by Corelli, in which he uses a somewhat archaic theme in the same way. The main way that this piece reaches towards the past is in its form. It's very clearly written in a clear two-part binary form, so A, B, B form, which was very rarely used by this time in history. By the time Rachmaninoff was composing, it wasn't very common to have exact repetitions of sections, in the same way that it had been for composers in the Baroque or classical periods. Rachmaninoff also creates the impression of a free recitative-like texture. For those of you who are foggy on this terminology, a recitative is an operatic form in which text is declaimed with a very free, kind of non-metrical, non-steady rhythm. It's supposed to be somewhere in between an aria, an actual kind of song, and speech. Originally, recitatives were supposed to be where the plot was advanced, where there was a lot of text and stuff happening. But oftentimes recitatives could become extremely expressive as well. And even in the 19th century, operatic forms, such as Wagner's music dramas, which ostensibly do away with recitative altogether in favor of continuous melody, there are many recitative-like passages that you can still find that are extremely expressive. These passages capitalize on this kind of halfway in between speech and song character of the recitative, which is a very peculiar and interesting kind of effect. Well, in this piece, Rachmaninoff creates this kind of recitative-like freedom by breaking up the phrase units of his theme with rests. And this is a very interesting point which shows how composers oftentimes worked and how brilliantly Rachmaninoff could alter common structural tropes in his themes. The theme of this piece in its conception is really in 3/4. So if it was written completely normally, it would sound like this. However, for expressive effect, and to lend the music an improvised, recitative-like feel, Rachmaninoff adds silences, which speak as loudly as the notes themselves. This elongates the rhythmic structure into 4/4 for the most part, although we can still see the remnants of the original 3/4 conception where Rachmaninoff changes the time signature for one measure to 3/4. So I think you can hear that this really elevates the whole expression of this theme. It brings it out of normalcy into something much more anguished and remarkable. It's an eloquent example of how much can be done with silence when you apply it with taste and artistry. So Rachmaninoff alters the theme itself to render it more expressive and unusual in shape, and he does the same thing to the form as well. As I said, it's obviously written in a straightforward rounded binary form, which would normally run A, A, B, B. And in a binary form, the B sections usually would contain a partial or complete return to the A section. And that's exactly what happens here. There's a recap of the A section, but varied so that it sounds more like a funeral march now. Rachmaninoff changes the outlines here a little bit, though, by eliminating the first repeat. So he makes it an A, B, B. And he also marks the second section repeat to be optional. This is a very important point. He marks ad libitum, which simply means that you can take the repeat or not. And this is another aspect of romantic composition. You'll oftentimes see this in the works of Liszt as well. Liszt will mark optional cuts and things like that, which make the form much more fluid. Liszt also oftentimes writes ossia passages, alternative passages that you can take, which have different musical solutions to the same passage. This makes the form much more fluid, since a lot now depends on the whim of the performer, and that's very much in keeping with the romantic ideal. So this piece really becomes a perfect meeting place between the archaic kind of Baroque style form and some of the harmonies and this kind of romantic freedom. In character, this is obviously an elegy, and one of the most moving that Rachmaninoff wrote. The sense of mourning and grief is made very clear by the funeral march-like segment that I mentioned in the B section. And in my imagination, I also hear the sounds of tolling bells in the left hand in certain places in this funeral march. So I play accordingly, as you might hear, adding some pedal to create that sound. One more little curious note, the cadence at the end of this piece, which uses a 4/3 suspension, again has a quite archaic Baroque-like sound to it. It was no longer very common to use this kind of a suspension at cadences in the Romantic period. It was a very common cadential formula for Baroque composers, on the other hand. Beyond that, I always thought it reminded me of a specific piece, and I finally realized that it is in fact the exact same notes and voicing as the end of Bach's famous D minor organ toccata. The only difference is that it's been transposed down a third into B minor. I don't know if this was an intentional similarity. It's so similar that I have to kind of think so. But it may have been unconscious, and he just used this voicing to help create this kind of distant, archaic sound. Either way, it's an interesting detail and indicative of the care Rachmaninoff took with the sound in this final cadence. Please do enjoy the complete performance of this piece, and do, as usual, consider supporting the channel. You can do that easiest probably through signing up to my account on patreon.com, www.patreon.com/independentpianist. Even if you just sign up for a couple dollars a month, that would be enormously helpful for allowing me to continue bringing you this content. So please do consider doing that. But if you can't do that, then please just like the video and subscribe on YouTube, and I will see you next week for some more great music. I've got some larger scale pieces coming up in the next couple of weeks, so those should be fun. So for now, this is Cole Anderson signing off.